October 24th, 1945. 2 a.m. Akershus Fortress. Oslo frost clings to the ancient stone walls of Akershus, its battlements silhouetted against a moonless sky. Inside the fortress prison, a single bare bulb flickers in a narrow corridor. The air is still heavy with the scent of damp wool and candle wax. Footsteps echo measured, deliberate. Two officers in crisp Norwegian army uniforms flank a man in a dark civilian suit, his hands bound loosely behind his back. His name is Vidkun Quisling. He pauses before a wooden door, breath visible in the cold. His eyes pale, unblinking, scan the hallway one last time. There's no crowd, no cameras, only silence and the weight of what comes next. He spent the last 5 months confined in this very cell, reading scripture, writing memoirs, insisting he acted for Norway's salvation. But outside these walls, the nation sees only betrayal. The word Quisling has already entered dictionaries from London to Moscow, not as a name, but as a noun, a traitor who collaborates with the enemy. Now, justice arrives not with fanfare, but with a rifle squad waiting in the courtyard. Dawn has not yet broken. But for Quisling, time has run out, and in this quiet moment before the crack of gunfire, a country prepares to close its darkest chapter. To understand Vidkun Quisling's fall, one must first trace the arc of his rise, not as a born villain, but as a man shaped by war, idealism, and the fractures of a turbulent age. Born on July 18, 1887, in Fyresdal, a remote valley in southern Norway, Quisling grew up in a household steeped in Lutheran piety and civic duty. His father was a Church of Norway pastor, his mother a schoolteacher. From an early age, he displayed exceptional intellect, graduating first in his class from the Norwegian Military Academy in 1911. Tall, lean, with sharp cheekbones and an austere bearing, he carried himself with the disciplined calm of an officer and the restless hunger of a reformer. His early career unfolded not on battlefields, but in the shadowed corridors of diplomacy and humanitarian aid. In 1918, as Europe lay shattered by the Great War, Quisling joined the Norwegian delegation to the newly formed League of Nations. There, he distinguished himself through administrative competence and fluency in multiple languages skills that soon earned him a posting to the Caucasus and later, Ukraine. It was in the famine-stricken regions of the Soviet Union in the early 1920s that Quisling first gained international notice. As deputy director of the League's relief mission, he coordinated food distribution to millions starving under Bolshevik rule. His reports meticulous, unsentimental, yet filled with quiet. Moral urgency commended him to Western governments. Even Leon Trotsky, no friend of foreign intervention, acknowledged Quisling's scrupulous neutrality. But the experience left scars. In the chaos of revolutionary Russia, Quisling witnessed the collapse of order, the rise of ideological extremism, and what he perceived as the weakness of liberal democracy in the face of mass upheaval. He returned to Norway in 1929, not as a hero, but as a man increasingly disillusioned with parliamentary politics. Norway, though neutral in the Great War, had not been immune to its aftershocks: economic instability, labor unrest, and the specter of communism spreading through Scandinavia. To Quisling, the answer lay not in socialism or traditional conservatism, but in a new kind of national unity, one forged through discipline, hierarchy, and a rejection of what he called decadent individualism. In 1931, he entered government as Minister of Defense in a short-lived agrarian-led cabinet. His tenure was marked by an obsession with internal security. He pushed for expanded surveillance of leftist groups, tighter border controls, and military modernization measures many saw as disproportionate to the actual threat. When his party lost power in 1933, Quisling did not retreat into obscurity. Instead, On May 17th, Norway's Constitution Day, he co-founded a new political movement, Nasjonal Samling, National Unity. The timing was deliberate. Constitution Day celebrated Norway's independence and democratic ideals. Quisling repurposed it as a launchpad for something radically different, a fascist-inspired party that rejected pluralism in favor of a single unifying national will. Nasjonal Samling's platform blended anti-communism, corporatist economics, Nordic racial mysticism, and deep admiration for Mussolini's Italy. Quisling, though never a gifted orator, projected an image of austere authority, cold, controlled, convinced of his own historical destiny. Yet Norway was not Germany or Italy. It was a small, prosperous, deeply democratic nation with a tradition of consensus politics. In the 1933 parliamentary elections, Nasjonal Samling won less than 2% of the vote. 2 years later, it dropped to 1.8%. The party remained marginal, ridiculed by mainstream press as a costume drama of jackboots and armbands with no real following. Even among Norway's conservative elite, Quisling was viewed as eccentric, an intelligent man who had lost his way. But then came the 1930s accelerating descent into global crisis. Hitler's rearmament, the Spanish Civil War, the Anschluss with Austria, the Munich Agreement, each event chipped away at the illusion of peace. Quisling watched with growing alarm, not because he opposed Nazi Germany, but because he feared Norway would be crushed between the great powers if it did not align itself preemptively. He began secret correspondence with German officials as early as the 1st of March 1933, just weeks after Hitler became chancellor. By 1939, he had visited Berlin multiple times, meeting with Alfred Rosenberg, head of the Nazi Party's Foreign Policy Office, and expressing admiration for Hitler's revolutionary clarity. Still, he remained a fringe figure in his own country. King Håkon VII, a constitutional monarch known for quiet resolve, refused to receive him. The military regarded him with suspicion. Even when war broke out in September 1939, few Norwegians imagined their neutrality would not protect them. Norway had not fought a war since 1814. Its armed forces were modest: 15,000 active personnel, outdated artillery, no tanks, and a navy that consisted mostly of coastal defense ships. Quisling, however, saw opportunity in chaos, while others prepared for blockade or humanitarian crisis. He prepared for power. In private letters to German contacts, he argued that Norway's strategic value, its long Atlantic coastline, its control of the Baltic Sea exit, and its role as the conduit for Swedish iron ore shipped through Narvik made it indispensable to Hitler's war machine. He offered himself as the man who could deliver Norway peacefully into the German orbit, sparing it invasion and bloodshed. He believed he was saving his country. In truth, he was already handing it over, and when the first German warships appeared off Oslo Fjord on April 9, 1940, Quisling would act not as a defender of Norway, but as its self-appointed surrender. April 9, 1940. Before dawn, the silence of Oslo Fjord was shattered by the low rumble of diesel engines. German destroyers, cloaked in fog and flying false Norwegian colors, glided past coastal forts that had not fired a shot in over a century. Operation Weserübung, Hitler's audacious plan to seize Denmark and Norway, was underway. Denmark fell in hours. Norway would not capitulate so easily. But before the first German boots touched Norwegian soil, Vidkun Quisling had already made his move. At 6:30 a.m., as German paratroopers descended on Oslo's Fornebu airport and warships entered the capital's harbor, Quisling walked into the studios of Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, NRK. Flanked by 2 aides in civilian clothes, he commandeered the airwaves. In a calm, deliberate voice, he announced to the stunned nation, The legitimate government has been removed. I am taking over executive power to ensure order and prevent bloodshed. It was a coup that existed only in his imagination. The sitting government, led by Prime Minister Johan Nygaardsvold, was still in session, unaware of Quisling's broadcast. King Haakon VII, though 67 and frail, was resolute. When German envoy Kurt Brewer demanded Norway accept Quisling as head of a new regime, the king refused. I cannot appoint a government led by a man who has seized power by force and without the consent of the people, he declared. The cabinet backed him unanimously. Quisling's declaration collapsed within hours. The broadcast was met not with acclaim, but with disbelief and outrage. Civil servants ignored his orders. Police chiefs refused to report to him. Even members of his own National Samling party were caught off guard. The Germans, too, were unimpressed. Hitler had authorized the invasion for strategic reasons, not to install Quisling. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary, Quisling has proclaimed himself prime minister. A bit premature. Within 48 hours, the Reich installed Joseph Terboven, a brutal Gauleiter from the Ruhr, as Reichskommissar of Norway. Terboven answered only to Hitler. He viewed Quisling not as a partner, but as a liability, an amateur with delusions of grandeur. On April 15th, Terboven dissolved all political parties except National Samling and declared martial law. Quisling was sidelined, given a minor advisory role, his authority hollow. For the next 2 years, Quisling remained in the shadows, nursing his grievances, writing manifestos, and pleading with German officials for a greater role. Meanwhile, Norway's resistance began to coalesce. Fishermen smuggled intelligence to Britain. Students printed underground newspapers. Teachers refused to teach Nazi-approved curricula. When the Germans ordered the arrest of Jewish citizens in October 1942, Norwegians organized a mass evacuation. Nearly 900 Jews fled by boat to neutral Sweden, thanks to a network of ordinary citizens. The spirit of Vermansdag, every man's duty, became the soul of the resistance. Quisling watched this defiance with growing frustration. He saw himself not as an oppressor, but as a misunderstood patriot trying to shield Norway from worse fates. In private, he lamented the German heavy-handedness. Publicly, he enforced it. In 1941, he authorized the creation of the Herden, the paramilitary wing of National Samling, modeled on the SS. It wore black uniforms, marched in formation, and carried out arrests, interrogations, and intimidation. Then, in February 1942, Terboven made a fateful decision. Facing mounting resistance and needing a facade of Norwegian legitimacy, he reinstated Quisling not as a puppet, but as minister-president of a national government. It was a propaganda gesture, but Quisling embraced it fully. He moved into the official residence at Victoria Terrace, surrounded by German guards. He signed decrees dissolving the Supreme Court, abolishing the Storting Parliament, and mandating compulsory membership in National Samling youth organizations. Most damningly, he collaborated in the Holocaust. On November 26, 1942, the SS ship Donau departed Oslo harbor carrying 532 Jewish men, women, and children to Auschwitz. Only 9 survived. Quisling did not personally order the deportation, but his regime provided the lists, the police, and the bureaucratic machinery that made it possible. When asked later why he did not intervene, he claimed he lacked the authority, a convenient fiction, given his signature on dozens of repressive laws dubbed by 1943. Norway was a nation under siege, not just by occupation, but by moral corrosion. Teachers, pastors, and civil servants who refused to swear loyalty oaths were imprisoned or sent to concentration camps like Grini, just outside Oslo. Over 50,000 Norwegians were arrested during the war. Nearly 10,000 were sent to camps in Germany and Poland. Quisling's name became synonymous with collaboration. Even in Berlin, officials rolled their eyes at his self-importance. Himmler reportedly called him a harmless fool, useful only for window dressing. Yet Quisling believed history would vindicate him. He envisioned post-war Norway as a Nordic socialist state, aligned with a victorious Germany, cleansed of democracy's weaknesses. He kept detailed diaries, gave speeches on national radio, and commissioned portraits of himself in heroic poses. All the while, the Allies advanced. Stalingrad fell. Italy surrendered. Today arrived in Norway. The resistance grew bolder. Sabotage operations targeted railways, factories, and Gestapo headquarters. In February 1945, Norwegian commandos trained. And Britain blew up the heavy water plant at Vemork, crippling Germany's nuclear ambitions. The tide had turned dark by early 1945. Quisling knew the Reich was collapsing. Yet he made no attempt to flee. He stayed in his office, drafting constitutional reforms for a Norway that no longer wanted him. On May 8, 1945, victory in Europe Day Germany surrendered unconditionally. In Oslo, crowds flooded the streets, waving flags, singing the national anthem. Quisling remained in Victoria Terrace. Alone. The next morning, May 9th, he walked calmly to the office of the Norwegian police. "I am here to place myself under your protection," he said. He was arrested without resistance. The man who had tried to hand Norway to the Nazis now awaited judgment from the very democracy he had betrayed. Vidkun Quisling was not a cartoon villain. He was a man of contradictions, intelligent, disciplined, yet consumed by a messianic self-belief that blinded him to reality. Psychologists who later studied his writings noted a pattern of rigid thinking, moral absolutism, and a need for historical validation. He saw himself not as a servant of Hitler, but as Norway's savior from chaos. His diaries reveal a man who genuinely believed that aligning with Nazi Germany was a lesser evil, a pragmatic shield against Soviet communism and Western decadence. This internal narrative allowed him to justify every collaboration, every deportation, every suppression of dissent as acts of national preservation. But his tragedy was that Norway never shared his diagnosis of its illness, nor his prescribed cure. To his people, he was not a healer, but the disease itself. Tactical angle, collaboration as a double-edged sword from a military standpoint. Quisling's role offered the Germans short-term administrative convenience, but long-term strategic cost. His regime provided local police forces, bureaucratic infrastructure, and intelligence networks that eased occupation. Yet his very presence fueled resistance. Where a purely German administration might have been seen as a foreign yoke, Quisling's collaboration made the occupation feel like a civil betrayal, more intimate, more enraging. Sabotage cells formed not just to oppose Nazis, but to punish Quisling's. His attempt to conscript Norwegians into the SS failed spectacularly. Fewer than 6,000 volunteered out of a population of 3 million, many under coercion. Meanwhile, over 50,000 Norwegians actively participated in resistance networks. Quisling's legitimacy became a liability. It forced ordinary citizens to choose sides, and most chose Norway over him. Quisling's failed April 9, 1040 broadcast was one of history's first attempted media coups. He understood the power of radio, a new intimate medium that entered homes and commanded attention. By seizing NRK, he sought to project authority before the real government could respond. But technology alone could not manufacture consent. Within hours, the legitimate government broadcast from Hamar, then Elverum, then Exile in London, using BBC shortwave relays to reach Norwegians nightly. King Haakon's calm, resolute voice became a symbol of continuity. Meanwhile, Quisling's recordings, stiff, formal, devoid of emotional warmth, sounded alien in a culture that valued humility and consensus. The radio, which he hoped would crown him, instead exposed his isolation. In stark contrast to Quisling stood King Haakon VII, a Danish-born prince who became Norway's monarch in 1905. He embodied constitutional restraint and quiet courage. On April 10, 1940, with German troops advancing and Quisling claiming power, the king faced an ultimatum: appoint Quisling or face bombardment of Oslo. His cabinet advised capitulation to save lives. Haakon refused. "I cannot act against the will of my government," he said, "and I will not legitimize treason." He and the government fled north, then to Britain, where they led a government in exile for 5 years. From London, Haakon broadcast weekly messages that united Norwegians in resistance. His moral authority, not Quisling's decrees, became the compass of national identity. Leadership in this crucible was not about power, but about fidelity to principle. These angles converge. On a single truth, Quisling's betrayal was not merely political, it was existential. He offered Norway order, but stole its soul. Despite Quisling's unwavering loyalty, Nazi Germany never fully trusted him. Hitler himself dismissed him as a theorist, not a statesman. Reichskommissar Joseph Terboven treated him as a figurehead useful for domestic propaganda, irrelevant for real decisions. The SS and Gestapo operated independently, often bypassing Quisling's ministries entirely. When Quisling protested the deportation of Norwegian Jews or the execution of resistance fighters, his complaints vanished into bureaucratic voids. Even his appeals to Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi ideologue who had once encouraged him, went unanswered. By 1943, to the Germans, Quisling was a tool, not a partner. His very existence exposed the hollowness of their claim to respect Nordic brotherhood. They exploited him while regarding Norwegians as racially acceptable but politically naive. In the end, Quisling served German interests not because he was empowered, but because his desperation made him compliant. On April 19, 1940, just 10 days after Quisling's radio coup, the Times of London published an editorial titled Quisling. It read, "To writers, the word Quisling is a gift from the gods. If they had been ordered to invent such a word from scratch, they could not have found one so perfect." Overnight, Quisling entered the English lexicon not as a name, but as a universal term for traitor. The French used unquisline, the Dutch, inquisling. Even the Soviets adopted it in wartime propaganda. This linguistic immortality was a unique form of condemnation, not just punishment, but erasure of personhood. Quisling became less a man than a moral category, a warning against the seduction of power at the cost of loyalty. In Norway, children were taught that to call someone a Quisling was the deepest insult. The word outlived the war, the trial, even the generation that witnessed it. Quisling's execution was not an act of vengeance, but of restoration. Norway's post-war leaders faced a profound dilemma: how to punish collaboration without descending into chaos or mimicking the tyranny they had just escaped. They chose law over lynch mobs. A special court was established not retroactively, but under existing treason statutes dating back to 1902, which defined aiding the enemy during war as punishable by death. Quisling's trial, held in Oslo's courthouse in August-September 1945, was meticulously fair. He had defense lawyers, could cross-examine witnesses, and was allowed to speak at length. The prosecution presented 180 witnesses and thousands of documents, radio transcripts, deportation orders, secret police reports, all showing his active, willing role in oppression. When the death sentence was announced, it was not met with cheers, but with solemn silence. Norwegians understood. This was not about killing a man. It was about reclaiming the meaning of Norway itself. Together, These angles reveal a deeper truth. Quisling's story is not just about one man's betrayal, but about how societies rebuild moral order after it has been shattered. May 9, 1945, Oslo, Norway. The war in Europe was over. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds spilled into the streets, weeping, dancing, waving flags dyed by years of longing. In Oslo, the silence was different. It was the silence of a city, holding its breath, relieved, yes, but also haunted. 5 years of occupation had left invisible wounds. Neighbors who vanished in the night, families torn apart by suspicion, children who had learned to flinch at the sound of boots on cobblestones. And at the center of it all stood the man who would make collaboration respectable. Vidkun Quisling. At 10 a.m., Quisling walked from his residence at Victoria Terrace to the office of Police Chief Christian Welhaven. He wore a dark overcoat, a black hat, and carried a briefcase. He did not resist. He did not plead. He simply said, "I place myself under your protection." It was an odd choice of words. Protection, as if he feared the people more than the law. He was taken to Mologata 19, the city's central police station, where he was processed like any common criminal. Fingerprints taken, belongings catalogued, cell assigned. Yet everyone knew this was no ordinary prisoner. News of his arrest spread instantly. Within hours, crowds gathered outside the station, not shouting, but watching silent, stone-faced. Graffiti appeared on walls. Quisling equals death. Newspapers, now free from censorship, published front-page editorials demanding justice. The government in exile, led by Prime Minister Nygaardsvold, had returned to Oslo on May 13th. They faced an immediate crisis: how to handle the collaborators. Over 80,000 Norwegians were suspected of aiding the Nazis as civil servants, police officers, businessmen, even school teachers. Some had joined National Samling out of fear, others out of conviction. But Quisling was in a category of his own. The legal dilemma was profound. Norway had abolished the death penalty for ordinary crimes in 1905, but it remained on the books for treason during wartime under paragraph 86 of the Penal Code of Law, passed in 1902, long before Quisling was born. Some jurists argued that executing him would violate the principle of nulla pona sine, liege, no punishment without pre-existing law. Others countered that Quisling's actions dissolving parliament, enabling deportations, and forcing martial law went far beyond mere collaboration. He had attempted to usurp sovereignty itself. After days of debate, the government decided Quisling would be tried by a special tribunal, but under existing law. The court would consist of 5 judges, 3 from the Supreme Court, 2 appointed by the government to ensure impartiality. The trial would be public, recorded, and bound by strict rules of evidence. This was not to be a show trial. Norway, having endured the arbitrary justice of the Gestapo, would demonstrate that law could be both firm and fair. Quisling was moved to Akershus Fortress, a medieval stronghold that had served as a prison since the 17th century. His cell was small but clean, with a narrow window overlooking the Oslo fjord. He was allowed books, mostly religious texts, and permitted to write. He filled hundreds of pages with reflections, justifications, and drafts of speeches he would never deliver. He claimed he had saved Norway from worse, that without his intervention, the Germans would have executed thousands. A portrait, himself as a tragic visionary, misunderstood by his time. Meanwhile, prosecutors built their case. They gathered telegrams he had signed ordering the arrest of resistance members. They recovered lists of Jewish citizens provided by his interior ministry. They found recordings of his radio addresses urging Norwegians to accept German rule. Most damning was his role in the February 1942 establishment of the national government, which had no legal basis under the Norwegian constitution. By assuming executive power without parliamentary consent, He had committed high treason, not just against the state, but against the very idea of democracy. The trial began on August 18, 1945. The courthouse was packed. Reporters from around the world filled the press gallery. Survivors of Greenie and other camps sat in the front rows, their eyes fixed on the defendant. Quisling entered wearing a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. He did not slump. He did not sneer. He sat with the posture of a man who still believed history would judge him kindly. Prosecutor Anish Jod laid out the charges methodically, attempting to overthrow the constitutional government on April 9, 1040, serving as head of an illegal regime from 1940 to 1945, complicity in the deportation of Norwegian Jews enabling the execution of resistance fighters, forfeiting national sovereignty to a foreign power. Each charge was backed by documents bearing Quisling's signature. When it was his turn to speak, Quisling did not deny the facts. Instead, he framed them as acts of necessity. "I acted to prevent greater bloodshed," he said. "I believed Germany would win the war." In that context, collaboration was the only rational choice. He claimed he had tried to moderate German policies, though no evidence supported this. He spoke for hours, weaving a narrative of sacrifice and foresight. But the courtroom was unmoved. The turning point came not in a dramatic outburst, but in a quiet moment on September 4th, a survivor of the Donau deportation, testifying via written affidavit, too traumatized to appear in person, described how Quisling's police had knocked on his family's door at 3 a.m., separated parents from children, and loaded them onto trucks. "He called us undesirable elements," the witness wrote. "But we were Norwegians. We loved this country as much as he claimed to." That testimony crystallized what the trial was really about. Not just legality, but belonging. Quisling had betrayed not only the state, but the unspoken covenant of citizenship, the trust that binds a people together. The judges retired to deliberate. On September 10th, they returned with a verdict within hours. Guilty on all counts. Sentence: death by firing squad. Quisling showed no emotion. He simply nodded and stood outside. The nation exhaled. But the reckoning was not yet complete. September 10th, October 24th, 1945. Oslo. The verdict was unanimous. Vidkun Quisling stood in the dock as Chief Justice Gunnar Halvorsen read the sentence. For high treason against the Kingdom of Norway, for complicity in the persecution of fellow citizens, and for aiding an enemy power in time of war, the court sentences you to death. The words fell like stones into still water. Quisling's lips tightened, but his hands remained steady. He bowed slightly to the judges, a final, formal gesture, and was led away without a word. Appeals followed as required by law. Quisling petitioned the Supreme Court to review the constitutionality of the death penalty in his case. His defense argued that retroactive application of wartime treason statutes violated fundamental rights. The court rejected the appeal on October 10th, stating that paragraph 86 had existed since before Quisling's birth and applied explicitly to anyone who during war betrays the country to the enemy. The law was clear. The crime was unprecedented. The punishment stood. His final hope lay with King Haakon VII. Under Norway's constitution, the monarch held the power of clemency. On October 15th, Quisling wrote a personal letter to the king, now back in his palace after 5 years in exile. In it, he did not beg for mercy. Instead, he framed his life as one of sincere, if mistaken, patriotism. He asked only that his death not be used to deepen national divisions. The king, who had refused to legitimize Quisling in 1940, now refused to spare him in 1945. No reply was sent. The silence was the answer. In his cell at Akershus, Quisling spent his final days in quiet routine. He read the Bible especially. the Psalms, and the Gospel of John. He wrote letters to his wife, Maria, who had fled to Germany but was now under house arrest in Oslo. He drafted a final political testament, urging Norwegians to learn from this tragedy and build a stronger, more unified nation. He made no confession, no admission of wrongdoing. To the end, he saw himself as a martyr to a misunderstood cause. The execution was scheduled for 2 a.m. on October 24, chosen for its secrecy. The government feared public unrest, either a pro-Quisling demonstration, though none materialized, or a mob seeking vengeance. Better, they decided, to carry out justice in the dark. Away from spectacle. At 1:30 a.m., prison officials entered his cell. Quisling was dressed in a dark suit, white shirt, black tie, his choice. He declined a blindfold. "I wish to look my country in the eye," he reportedly said, though the quote cannot be independently verified. What is documented is that he walked calmly to the execution site, a small courtyard within Akershus Fortress, lit by 2 dim lanterns. A firing squad of 8 Norwegian soldiers, volunteers from the reconstituted army, stood at attention. They had drawn straws the night before. 4 would fire live rounds, 4 blanks, so no man could be certain if his bullet had killed. This was not German efficiency, but Norwegian humanity. Even in punishment, they preserved conscience. Quisling was tied to a wooden stake. A chaplain offered a prayer. Quisling whispered, "I thank God for my life." Then, at precisely 2:08 a.m., the command was given. Crack. He collapsed instantly. A medical officer stepped forward, checked for a pulse, and declared him dead at 2:10 a.m. There was no applause. No cheers. Only the wind off the fjord, cold and indifferent. His body was placed in a plain pine coffin and buried secretly in a corner of the fortress cemetery. The grave was unmarked. Within days, the location was lost. Even officials forgot the exact plot. It was as if Norway sought not just to execute Quisling, but to erase him from its soil. Yet the trial's true climax was not the execution. It was the precedent it set. In the months that followed, Norway prosecuted over 90,000 cases of collaboration. Most received fines or short prison terms. Teachers who taught Nazi ideology lost their licenses. Civil servants who enforced anti-Semitic laws were dismissed. But only 40 individuals, including Quisling, were sentenced to death, and of those, only 25 were actually executed. The rest had sentences commuted to life imprisonment. This restraint was deliberate. Norway chose accountability over vengeance, law over chaos. The Quisling trial became a model for post-war justice. It influenced the Nuremberg Tribunal's emphasis on individual responsibility, and later, the development of international human rights law. It proved that a small nation, traumatized and violated, could confront its darkest chapter with dignity, and, in that quiet courtyard at Akershus, as the first light of dawn touched the stone walls, Norway began to heal, not by forgetting, but by naming the betrayal, judging it, and laying it to rest. The execution of Vidkun Quisling did not end Norway's reckoning, it began it. In the weeks following October 24, 1945, the nation embarked on one of the most systematic and legally grounded purges of collaborators in post-war Europe. Over 92,000 individuals were investigated. Nearly 40,000 were formally charged. Of these, 17,000 received prison sentences. 28,000 were fined or lost civil rights, and 92 were sentenced to death under the wartime treason law. Ultimately, 25 executions were carried out, including Quisling's between 1945 and 1948. The rest had their sentences commuted, often to life imprisonment with hard labor. This process, known as landsvikopgigerd, the reckoning with national betrayal, was remarkable not for its severity, but for its restraint. Unlike France, where collaborators were sometimes shaved, paraded, or lynched in the streets, or Eastern Europe, where partisan justice devolved into score settling, Norway insisted on due process. Every accused had the right to legal counsel, to confront evidence, and to appeal. Special courts were created, but they operated within the framework of pre-existing law. The government, led by Labour Party Prime Minister Einar Gerhardsen, was determined that Norway would not become what it had just defeated. Women who had relationships with German soldiers, a common target of post-war scorn across Europe, were treated differently in Norway. Around 14,000 were registered as German girls, Tyskertuser. Many were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved, their names published, their children stigmatized for decades. Though not criminally prosecuted, as no law forbade consensual relations, they faced social exile. It was a moral purge disguised as national cleansing one that historians now recognize as a gendered injustice. Punishing women for sins that men in positions of power had committed on a far grander scale. Quisling's immediate legacy was physical erasure. His personal papers were seized and archived, not destroyed. His home was confiscated by the state. His party, Nationalsamling, was outlawed, its symbols, slogans, and uniforms banned under a 1945 law that remains in effect today. Even the word Quisling could not be used in official contexts, lest it give him posthumous prominence. Internationally, the trial sent a clear message. The Allies, particularly Britain and the United States, closely watched Norway's proceedings. The fairness of Quisling's trial, public, evidence-based, appealable, was cited as a contrast to Soviet show trials. In Eastern Europe, the New York Times called it a landmark in the restoration of civil order. In London, Winston Churchill, who had coined the phrase to quail as a verb in 1940, noted in his memoirs that Quisling's fate proved that even in the darkest hour, treason carries its own sentence. But within Norway, the emotional aftermath ran deeper than legal verdicts. Families were divided. Brothers had fought on opposite sides, one in the resistance, another in the SS. Communities that had relied on each other for survival during the war now avoided eye contact in the street. The trauma was not just of occupation, but of complicity, of discovering that the postman, the school teacher, the neighbor had reported someone to the Gestapo. To heal this fracture, Norway turned to memory. On May 8, 1946, the first anniversary of liberation, King Haakon VII presided over a national memorial service at Oslo's Domkirke. Survivors of concentration camps lit candles. Children placed flowers at the foot of the monument to civilian resistance. And in a symbolic act, the government announced that Quisling's unmarked grave would remain secret, not out of shame, but to deny him the martyrdom he craved. Yet the past refused to stay buried. In 1947, construction workers at Akershus Fortress unearthed human remains near the eastern wall. Forensic examination confirmed they were Quisling's. Fearing neo-Nazi pilgrimages, the government reburied him in a sealed concrete vault beneath the fortress location undisclosed, access forbidden. His body, like his name, was locked away. But ideas cannot be buried so easily. And as the decades passed, questions returned not about his guilt, which was never in doubt, but about what his life revealed about democracy, loyalty, and the seduction of authoritarian order in times of fear. In the decades after 1945, Vidkun Quisling's name faded from daily discourse, but never from collective memory. His physical absence, no grave to visit, no statue to topple, made him a ghost haunting Norway's national conscience. Yet his legacy endured in subtler, more profound ways. Legally, the Quisling trial set a precedent that resonated far beyond Scandinavia. It reinforced the principle that individuals could be held accountable for crimes committed under the banner of state authority, a concept later enshrined in the Nuremberg Principles. Norway's insistence on using pre-existing law rather than creating retroactive statutes became a benchmark for transitional justice. In the 1990s, during the Yugoslav war crimes tribunals, Norwegian jurists served as prosecutors and judges, drawing on the ethical framework forged in the aftermath of Quisling's trial. Culturally, Quisling became a permanent fixture in global language. The Oxford English Dictionary formally added it in 1943. By 1950, it appeared in dictionaries from Tokyo to Buenos Aires. In literature, it was used by Orwell, Camus, and Solzhenitsyn not just as a historical reference, but as a moral shorthand for betrayal from within. Even today, the term surfaces in political debates worldwide. In Ukraine during the 2014 annexation of Crimea, in the U.S. Capitol aftermath of January 6, 2021, and in Hong Kong during pro-democracy crackdowns. Each time, it carries the same weight. Not merely disloyalty, but the corruption of trust by someone who owed fealty. In Norway itself, the reckoning evolved from punishment to pedagogy. By the 1960s, schools began teaching the occupation not as a tale of heroes and villains, but as a study in moral choice. Students analyzed Quisling's speeches, compared them to King Haakon's broadcasts, and debated, could it happen again? Museums played a crucial role. The Norwegian Resistance Museum, housed within Akershus Fortress, the very site of Quisling's execution, opened in 1966. Its exhibits juxtapose Nazi propaganda posters with handwritten notes from underground printers, Gestapo interrogation tools with smuggled radios. Quisling is presented not as a monster, but as a cautionary figure, intelligent, patriotic in his own mind, yet blind to the humanity he trampled. Historians, too, have revisited his story with nuance. While never excusing his actions, scholars like Hans Fredrik Dahl and Tor Gjelsvik have explored the psychological and geopolitical pressures that shaped him. Dahl's 1991 biography, Quisling, A Study in Treason, revealed a man torn between megalomania and genuine fear of Soviet expansion, a fear shared, in part, by Western powers before 1941. Yet the research only deepened the consensus. Understanding is not absolution. Perhaps the most telling legacy lies in Norway's post-war identity. The trauma of occupation forged an enduring commitment to democracy, transparency, and human rights. Norway became a founding member of the United Nations in 1945 and later played outsized roles in peacekeeping and humanitarian diplomacy. Domestically, the Labour Party, once wary of centralized power, embraced social democracy not as ideology, but as social glue, universal health care, strong labor unions, free education. These were not just policies. They were bulwarks against the kind of despair that breeds fascism. Even Quisling's ideological project, Nordic racial purity, was systematically dismantled. Post-war Norway rejected biological nationalism in favor of civic unity. In 1950, Norway granted citizenship to all surviving Jewish Norwegians who returned. And in 2007, the government formally apologized for its role in the Holocaust, acknowledging that Norwegian police carried out arrests on Norwegian soil under a Norwegian regime. And yet, echoes remain. In the 2011 terrorist attacks by far-right extremist Anders Breivik, who cited Quisling as an influence in his Manifesto Norway, faced a chilling repetition, a nationalist claiming to save the country through violence and exclusion. The nation's response was telling. Instead of panic or repression, Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg declared, "Our answer is more democracy, more openness, and greater political participation." It was a direct echo of 1945, not vengeance, but reaffirmation. Quisling's body lies entombed in concrete beneath Akershus. But his name lives not as a hero, not even as a footnote, but as a warning etched into the language of justice itself. Norway did not just execute a traitor. It buried the idea that betrayal could ever be mistaken for patriotism. There is a quiet power in how nations remember their darkest hours. Some bury them in silence. Others weaponize them for new divisions. But Norway chose a third path, to stare directly into the eyes of its betrayal, and to name it, judge it, and learn from it. Vidkun Quisling's story is not merely the chronicle of one man's descent into treachery. It is a mirror held up to the fragile architecture of democracy itself. Quisling was not born a villain. He was educated, capable, even compassionate in his early humanitarian work. He loved Norway deeply, fiercely, but he came to believe that love justified control. That order outweighed freedom, and that survival demanded surrender to a greater power. In that belief, he mistook submission for strategy, complicity for statesmanship. His tragedy was not ignorance, but certainty, the conviction that he alone understood what his country needed, even when his country screamed otherwise. And that is the enduring lesson. Authoritarianism rarely arrives with jackboots and declarations of tyranny. It often knocks politely, wrapped in the language of necessity, national pride, and protection from chaos. It offers simplicity in place of debate, strength in place of compromise, and a single voice in place of many. Quisling did not seek to destroy Norway. He sought to save it from democracy, from diversity, from the messy, imperfect work of self-governance. But democracies are not machines to be optimized. They are living ecosystems built on trust, accountability, and the willingness to listen, even when we disagree. The Norwegian resistance did not win with armies alone. They won with teachers who refused to teach lies, pastors who hid fugitives, fishermen who rowed Jews to safety in the dead of night. They won because ordinary people understood that loyalty is not to a leader, but to a covenant, the promise that no one is above the law, and no voice is too small to matter. Quisling's execution was necessary, but it was not the true victory. The real triumph came in the courtrooms, classrooms, and town halls that followed in a society that chose restoration over revenge, law over lynching, memory over amnesia. It came in the deliberate decision to teach children not just that Quisling was wrong, but why he was wrong, because he placed ideology above humanity, power above principle, and himself above his people. Today, as democracies around the world face new surges of populism, disinformation, and historical revisionism, the word Quisling remains more than a relic. It is a diagnostic tool. It reminds us that the greatest threats to freedom often come not from outside invaders, but from within, from those who claim to love their country while undermining its soul. And yet, Norway's story also offers hope. It shows that nations can confront their complicity without collapsing into bitterness. That justice, when tempered with fairness, can heal as well as punish. That even after 5 years of darkness, a country can choose light, not by pretending the shadows never existed, but by ensuring they never fall again. Vidkun Quisling's name is forgotten in most places, except where it matters most. In Norway, it is spoken softly, not in anger, but in warning. Not as a specter, but as a lesson carved into the bedrock of national identity. For in the end, the fate of traitors is not written in blood, but in memory. And Norway remembered.